So in this screencast, given the limitations that we've discussed with the neoclassical approach to accounting for determinants of demand, we're going to consider what role there is for behavioural economics and how behavioural economics can contribute and allow different perspectives and allow us to better understand demand for sport in the round. And to do this, we're going to look at the work of Igor Skitovsky, who's been particularly influential when it comes to behavioural economics applied to sport and recreation. So, Skitovsky's main work in this area, not to say his only work, but his main work is 1976's The Joyless Economy. And in this book, he criticises the limitations of neoclassical theory by saying that by assuming that consumers have a given set of tastes and preferences, we're not really understanding the total picture of consumer demand. And so his emphasis is to say that beings aren't necessarily rational automatons who are necessarily utility maximizers, that we need to look beyond this and we need to look for the motivational force behind behaviour. And this will help us understand how preferences are formed, and it will help us understand the differences in consumer preferences and some of the patterns of demand that exist in the sport industry. And to do this, Skitovsky turned to psychology. So psychology and economics has always been there, but he in particularly looked at the theory and concept of arousal. So Skitovsky identifies that feelings of satisfaction or dissatisfaction are caused by an individual's level of arousal. So too much arousal and too little arousal can both be unpleasant situations that we may not want to be in. Now, on the slide here, there's a fairly extreme example. So solitary confinement of prisoners and stimulus deprivation can lead to physical pain, nausea and confusion. Now, that's an extreme example, but I'm sure you're aware of situations where you have been in a situation which is not particularly arousing, where you might feel general boredom and lethargy and a lack of energy. And this can be, this can cause a level of dissatisfaction. So boredom, ennui, a lack of anything to do, a lack of stimulation can cause feelings of dissatisfaction. And equally on the other hand, so, the example here is that an executive faced with too much exceedingly demanding work, we could be saying a student with too many deadlines for work which is too difficult, which expects too much of students, is putting situations in a position of stress. Yeah? And the arousal, the stress is too high. It's beyond your ability to cope. Okay, and that can cause feelings of dissatisfaction and stress. Okay, so there is a level of arousal, and too much arousal and too little arousal are both things, but there is an optimum level of stimulation, of arousal. Yeah, and this optimum level of stimulation gives rise to a sense of comfort, fulfillment and well-being. Below this, so for example, you as students, you would want to be given tasks and work which is engaging and stimulating and that makes you think and that enables you to think, so you feel like you're accomplishing something, you're spending your time here at university well. If we weren't giving you enough, or the work was too easy, or it didn't really stretch you, you'd probably find that you were bored, and that might lead you to kind of drop out the course, do something else. You might not feel particularly satisfied by the course. Too much work pitched at too high a level, assuming too much prior knowledge, that too might cause you a problem. But somewhere in the middle, if we get things right, then you should feel engaged, comfortable, and have a general sense of confidence and well-being. Okay. And if it's when an individual falls below the optimum or above it, that these feelings of boredom or anxiety provide the inducement to attempt to return to the optimum level. Okay, so Skytowski gives really basic examples such as things like hunger. Hunger is a level of arousal which is kind of dissatisfaction, but we can go out and we can eat, and that leads us back to a sense of satisfaction and feeling satisfied. Yeah. So, but what Skytowski is really talking about is this kind of search for optimal arousal, and that provides the motivation for human behaviour. So it's a situation where we're not overstimulated and we're not understimulated. Sounds a bit like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, but the level of stimulation is just right. So, in thinking about satisfaction, we need to think about comfort and pleasure. And in Skytowski's work, these are two different things, right? So, Skytowski says, and he looks at kind of psychology to identify this, that consumers are motivated to seek satisfactions, and there are two distinct sources of satisfaction that help explain consumer behaviour, and these are comfort and pleasure. And comfort are those activities that relieve physical pain or distress, fatigue and stress, or that save time, effort and skill. Okay, so the example of eating when we are hungry provides comfort. Okay, sitting down and watching television at the end of a long week on a Friday night, sitting down and watching some kind of fairly brainless television, if you like, can be a good source of, kind of just, I just want to sit down, I want to relax, I want to feel comfortable, right? Now, and that doesn't necessarily involve a lot of effort or skill on your behalf. You are fairly passive in your consumption of this. And Skytowski classifies this as defensive consumption or want satisfaction. Okay, so really Skytowski talks about defensive consumption. Broader economics might classify this as want satisfaction. Okay. Now, on the other hand, Skytowski talks about pleasure. And pleasure is those activities which engage and develop mental and physical capacities. So engagement and development are the key terms here. You need to want to engage in something and be a part of it. Yeah. So you create your own leisure or sporting activity. So I suppose it's a difference between comfort could be sit down and half watch a game on television. Pleasure could be actually take part in playing a game of sport, right? And Skytowski classifies this as creative consumption. So consumption which involves the consumer in the creation of the product to a greater extent than some of the activities that might fall under comfort. And he also refers to this as stimulation seeking behaviour, right? And generally, defensive consumption maintains life and makes it easier. So I'm hungry, I eat, I need so eating is a kind of basic physiological need, and there's also a psychological need, a comfort need there, and a feeling of satisfaction which is derived from this. Okay, so defensive consumption maintains life and makes it easier, right? So quick meals, quick leisure, quick hits of things, which are easy, which you don't have to engage your brain an awful lot. While creative consumption, on the other hand, provides most of life's pleasures. Okay, so he sees a difference between kind of different types of consumption. Defensive consumption or want satisfaction, right? And creative consumption or stimulation seeking. So one of Skytowski's criticisms of neoclassical economics and economics in general and the economic system that we have is that economics as a branch of study only deals with want satisfaction and ignores stimulation seeking behaviour. Okay, to actually, stimulation seeking behaviour can involve stretching yourselves and putting yourselves in a kind of on the fringe of optimal arousal into too much stress, right? Which can be a situation which, economics wouldn't see that as kind of, a rational decision. Where would the utility be? So the first time someone went skiing, for example, you might have found it frightening, worrying, scared of falling, but the sense of achievement and the sense of getting better and developing skills in this area may ultimately give you satisfaction. Yeah, but economics doesn't really account for that as rational behaviour. So what Scitovsky says is that stimulation seeking behaviour could be seen as the motivation behind much demand for participation sport. Not all demand, but a lot of demand for participation sport is about stimulation seeking. Yeah, competitive sport, putting yourself in a situation where you're competing against someone, there may be pressure, and that pressure might actually at one level cause you to perform quite well, but it might actually cause kind of feelings of trepidation, worry, anxiety before you actually begin the competition. So any of you who's played competitive sport might recognise that, and it's some of it's good and some of it might be deemed as a disutility as well. And neoclassical economics doesn't therefore address one of the main determinants of demand, Scitovsky says, and that's one of its limitations. So in critiquing neoclassical economics, we can say that it ignores the kind of stimulation seeking behaviour, which is the rationale for a lot of sporting behaviour. Okay, not all sporting behaviour, but some sporting behaviour. Yeah? A lot of sporting behaviour is not, there is no competition, it's purely social, it's good fun, but some sporting participation has a competition element in it, which actually, creates a different set of motivations and conditions, and may be more stimulating in many ways. So Scitovsky actually directly mentions sport and physical activity, right? And in this quote, he's saying that activity is a weapon against boredom, so suboptimal arousal, so boredom when you're not stimulated enough, but it's also pleasant. And he says it's most pleasant when it fully engages our skills and powers, right? So I play basketball. I might like playing a kind of unserious game of basketball, but perhaps if I look back and say, what's some of the best times when I've played, it's when I've been involved in a team, we've beat a team who we thought were probably better than us or very well matched, and it was a close game, and there were kind of, so there was a lot of pleasure derived from that, right? And, to get ready for this game, we trained, we practiced, we kind of developed our skills to be able to compete at this level. And Scitovsky also says that higher animals also engage in playful combat and other forms of competitive behaviour. So it's a natural, and if you know anything about kind of Maslow's hierarchy of need, you could say that this is this kind of self fulfillment is a kind of higher order need in kind of psychological terms. So stimulation is important in Scitovsky's theory, and the basic source of stimulation is experience that is new, unexpected, or surprising. If it's completely outside our previous experience, it can be disturbing. And Scitovsky says that what is not new enough and surprising enough is boring, what is too new is bewildering, and an intermediate degree of newness seems most pleasing. And this is a really key point here. So the enjoyment of novelty, if we put some people who don't feel equipped into a situation which is kind of beyond their experience, then they can find that disturbing and not satisfying, and actually it can cause anxiety. So what Skytowski says is that people need to become skilled in learning to deal with new and stimulating situations in order to be able to derive pleasure from them. Because if they haven't got what Skytowski refers to as consumption skills, coping skills, consumption skills, to be able to deal with different situations, then they're not going to derive pleasure or as much pleasure from stimulation. And their natural reaction might be to not engage with this, or to react or to disengage from this. So we might think in terms of determinants of demand for participation sport. Are sufficient people within our society equipped through education and their experiences to be able to develop consumption skills? So this extends not just to kind of sport, but other forms of leisure as well. So it doesn't happen so much now, but if I used to have to queue up a long time at a post office or at the bank or any kind of appointment at the doctor's surgery in a hospital, and this is in the days before people had phones and access, then you could see people who could read a book and get out and could engage in that, and they develop, and there is a skill to be able to sit down and read for an hour while you wait, and to be able to be fully engaged in that. And other people who hadn't developed the kind of same kind of reading skills to be able to concentrate for this period of time, they were bored out their minds, and you could see this. So, around the time that I was studying this kind of stuff, those are examples that I could see in real life that kind of thought, well, all right, there is such a thing as consumption skills, and some people have got them, and that allows them to kind of, occupy themselves and make good use of leisure time. And other people are less able, they don't have these consumption skills. So the real thing about consumption skills is that enjoyment of novelty requires learning. And from my point of view, we can talk about production skills. So you can be trained to be able to become more productive at work. The skills you are acquiring now on this course are designed to make you more employable and more productive in the workplace, because there's a scarcity of those skills. So we train and we educate people. We educate people through schools. We train people in jobs through ongoing professional development to become more productive at work. And at the same time, well, on the other hand, there are a set of, in the same way of thinking, a set of consumption skills which could be developed in people, which enable them to become more productive in their use of leisure time. So back when we talked about government involvement in sport, we said there is a government tendency to subsidise and promote certain activities which are associated with being merit goods, with positive personal and external benefits, those externalities, and there are some which we associate with personal and societal damage, and that can be recreational activity along the lines of too much gambling, irresponsible gambling, irresponsible use of substances, which can lead to kind of personal and societal issues. Okay, so consumption skills are required to enable people to be more productive in their use of leisure time, right? And so I've already talked to you about the example of, as you train and become better at a sport, it can become more fulfilling, right? So for activities that provide the potential for skill consumption, the same leisure activity can continue to be stimulating as the consumer's skills develop. The nature of their enjoyment also changes, right? So, you can remain through kind of developing skills and consumption skills and getting better in sport. You can stay engaged. You can continually be stimulated, right? There's always something new you can work on. You can always do something better in sport. You've always got a weakness that you can work on. You've always got a skill to try to develop to make you better as a performer, as a competitor, right? Now, tastes and preferences will vary from individual to individual because different participants have got different skills, experience and interests. And for example, what's stimulating to a marathon runner might be, you know, a feeling of achievement and being able to pace yourself and keep on going. But a rugby player might be more interested in shorter anaerobic bursts of power and team play and working with other people. And so what stimulates the marathon runner might not stimulate the rugby player. Equally, people in the same location doing the same activity. And a good example is a skier on a nursery slope for the first time. That might be terrifying to them, but for a capable skier, a nursery slope is not going to stimulate them and they're going to want to do something different, yeah? But anyway, this kind of, you know, different levels of backgrounds, experience, interests and skills can account for different tastes and preferences. And this means that demand for sport is heterogeneous rather than homogeneous. And heterogeneous means it's fragmented. There are many different types of demand for different types of sporting activity. It is not homogeneous. So Scitovsky in this way helps us understand the demand for the diversity of sport. And we've seen when we've looked at participation sport that aside from the few big participation sports, so going to the gym, swimming, jogging, football, and then once you get much beyond that, you're looking at very, very minority sports in terms of participation. Okay, so demand in sport is heterogeneous rather than homogeneous. Scitovsky, and this relates to a concept we looked at when we talked about Juliet B. Shaw's work on the overworked American. Scitovsky's got a kind of a view which is somewhat comparable or analogous to Juliet B. Shaw's work, but he comes at it from a slightly different point of view. So Scitovsky characterises the USA as being a joyless economy, and he says that American education and American society places too much emphasis on production skills, i.e. being able to get a good job, but not enough on the acquisition of consumption skills. So what to do with your leisure time, you know, so the kind of creative consumption is sacrificed for the kind of, you know, the more kind of passive consumption that we talked about when we looked at comfort and pleasure. Okay. Now, what he's saying is that Americans therefore tend to seek pleasure through want satisfaction rather than stimulation seeking. And what he says is that want satisfaction has got a limited capacity to satisfy people over the long term. Once basic demands for material goods have been met, once you've bought that good, you've got it, there's less opportunity for pleasure through want satisfaction because, you know, many of us won't think, well, what's the next thing to buy now? Or the satisfaction that I derive from owning this, right? And he says that this has led to the US becoming an affluent but ultimately bored and joyless society. So this is quite similar, isn't it, to Juliet B. Shaw's idea that, you know, Americans are prioritising work, yeah, over leisure. They've taken the productivity dividend and use it to be able to consume and buy more stuff, which is this cycle of work and spend. And perhaps this is because, if we look at Scitovsky's hypothesis or theory, Americans lack the consumption skills to engage in creative leisure, creative consumption, right? And what he says is that demand for leisure time would be higher if consumers had more consumption skills. Now that's something for us to consider when we move on to conclude this lecture, as we're doing now. So, how does Scitovsky's theory then change our understanding of the demand for sport? Well, it adds a third category. Right at the start of this lecture, we talked about consumption demand, and we talked about non-durable consumption goods, right? We talked about investment demand as well, and durable consumption goods, investment in personal capital and health, and capital goods such as investment of our time into sport in order to be able to become more employable. They are categories that we can identify through neoclassical economics. But what he says is this adds a third kind of demand, and this is stimulation seeking demand. This is people actively seeking discomfort, fear or danger, at least initially, to feel arousal, right? And to engage in this and to derive pleasure from this requires consumption skills. Now, Scitovsky says, and thinking back to what we said about government intervention in the sports market, the lack of consumption skills in the population could be an example of market failure, right? Because people aren't demanding enough of what is good for them, okay? And therefore government has a role in raising consumption skills to a level which increases demand for the positive use of leisure time, and so changes over the longer term tastes and preferences in the population. So what Scitovsky is saying is there could be some kind of demand side activity in terms of the government by educating people, whether it's through the school system or through educating people for a world where there might be less work and more free time, which is interesting in this current period of lockdown and in the post-COVID period, or the COVID period when unemployment might increase. Is how do we increase people's consumption skills so that they can engage in meaningful leisure time activity? Okay, there are some people that can do and some people that can't. But what he's saying is that tastes and preferences aren't fixed, and they aren't necessarily just determined by individuals. Outside intervention can actually change those tastes and preferences. So stimulation seeking is a third category of demand, and tastes and preferences can change as people develop consumption skills. So they're not fixed as they are in the neoclassical kind of approach. So really that is the conclusion and the end of this lecture. So thanks very much for listening.